Yeah, that was scene 38. Thanks.
Sounds right.
Okay, we're talking with Harry van Moorst. This is scene 35, take one.
Go.
34. Harry, tell me about other things apart from Don't Register Campaign.
Apart from the Don't Register campaign, we also ran other kinds of protest and resistance activities, such as the Fill Out a Falsesy campaign, where people filled out false registration forms in order to block up the bureaucracy. We organised incitement campaigns where people incited young men not to register for national service, which was, of course, itself an offence, and therefore that led to a lot of court cases and civil disobedience activities. And of course we organised a lot of occupations of members of parliament, of the national service officers, where people would sit in for hours, days on end at times, as a way of disrupting the machinery and protesting and resisting the whole apparatus of conscription.
Cut. Thank you. Harry, what was the reasoning behind funding the NLF?
Well, the reason people felt that we should be supporting the National Liberation Front was because by 1967-68 it was obvious to many of us that the National Liberation Front had justice, historical correctness on their side. They were the ones who were legally, morally and politically justified in waging war in Vietnam against the United States and against Australia. We had to make up our minds as to whose side we were really on. It wasn't any point, we felt, sitting on the fence. So it was felt one of the best ways of showing this and forcing people in Australia to think about who was right in Vietnam and to make it clear to everybody that this wasn't something that the government could take for granted any longer. We decided that sending money to provide medical assistance to the National Liberation Front was a very useful way of both assisting them at the same time as raising consciousness and political debate in Australia.
How did your conscience handle that?
Obviously there was no intent to see monies that were raised here actually lead to the deaths of Australian conscripts who were sent over there. But at the same time it was felt that the issue was too important to let the possibility of that stand in the way. It was recognised that sending aid to the National Liberation Front may well lead to strengthening them in their fight against Australia. Our position was simply that anything that strengthened their fight against Australian and United States aggression in Vietnam was a good thing, and that we should be supporting that. And so that's why we did it.
Surely, funding the enemy like that, they're bound to use the money to throw bullets back at us.
But the thing is that by this time, the history of the Vietnam War was very well known to us, and we did not see the National Liberation Front as the enemy. Just because the government said they were the enemy, we didn't believe that. And in fact, our studies showed very clearly that they were not the enemy, that the enemy, in fact, was the United States government and the way it was operating and the way that the Australian government was prepared to toady behind. And therefore, it wasn't a case of us supporting the enemy. It was a case of us supporting those who were right and just in that war. And the fact that the Australian soldiers were being sent over there to fight against those who were right and just was a real problem. But the problem was primarily that of the government, not ours.
Thanks, Carl. Thank you. Hey, what were some of the nasty things that happened to you in regards to what sort of police action happened against you?
Oh, a range of things. Being beaten by the police was not something that was uncommon to many of the demonstrators. I got knocked out by the police in the Carlton cells. Going to jail and being harassed by warders, having your hair cut very short and hacked about, being pushed around and threatened. The death threats that came both from police at some times and from other anonymous callers and writers and so on. But these were things that came with the territory for a while there.
Yeah. How many times did you go to jail?
I went to jail altogether about 4 times, if you mean by jail going to actual jail sentences. So I had 4 jail sentences where I went to prison for 5 days, 10 days, 4 days at one time and a couple of nights. And apart from that, of course, there were a lot of other arrests where they might keep you till 2 o'clock in the morning at the local watch house.
Harry, can you just tell me very briefly what the first moratorium march was all about? Well,
the first moratorium march was really the culmination of anti-war sentiment in Australia. It was the first time that large numbers, in Melbourne 100,000, in Sydney 50,000 or so, took to the streets to protest against the war, despite the fact that politicians and media and everybody else was lambasting them for even attempting such a thing.
Jim Cairns was the figurehead of that first moratorium?
Yeah, Jim Cairns was the figurehead. He played a very major role in developing the public front of the moratorium movement, and was very instrumental in getting ALP support and credibility for the anti-war stands.
Yeah. Harry, tell me about the difference between Melbourne and Sydney with the first moratorium.
The Melbourne moratorium was very large and considerably larger than Sydney. I think primarily because in Melbourne you had a very strong and far more left-wing ALP, partly because the DLP, the more conservative elements, had split off. And so you had a strong left-wing Labor movement, strong left-wing section of the ALP, and that helped to set the scene for a much more active militant movement generally, including amongst the students.
Cut. Thank you. Could you tell me the difference between the second and third moratoriums?
There was a major shift between the second and the third moratoriums from a sort of tacit support for draft resistance to a very active stance taken by the Victorian Moratorium Campaign against conscription by supporting draft resistance and by inciting young people, young men, not to register for national service. And this culminated during the third moratorium with, of course, a truck in the middle of the demonstration with 5 draft resistors who were underground and sought by the police and the government, who simply said to the police, "Get us if you can." And with 50, 60,000 people around the truck, of course, the police couldn't do it, but they made an attempt at one stage.
So after the march was over, where did you take these underground people? Where did you take them?
Well, about 20,000 of us marched back from the finish of the rally to Melbourne University, surrounding the truck with police following and going down side streets trying to look for an opening. And when we got to Melbourne University, we had there some secret sort of escape routes and plans organised so that we could get them away without any risk, and that worked quite successfully.
Harry, could you, what were your personal feelings towards the Australian fighting man?
My feelings towards them were very ambivalent.
Your feelings towards the Australian service?
Yeah. My feelings towards Australian servicemen serving in Vietnam was very ambivalent. At times I felt a certain amount of empathy. I felt sorry for anybody who's sent to go to war to kill people, even more so when in fact the cause is unjust, as I felt it was. On the other hand, at times I felt very angry with them for not being prepared to stand up and say no to the government, for not being prepared to read their history and find out what was really going on and why they were over there in the first place. So there was that sort of ambivalence. But I didn't see them as traitors in the way that some people in the movement, for instance, saw them, who really thought that they were traitors to the Vietnamese people and to justice in general, and had no time for them at all. So there was that ambivalence, and at times I felt a certain amount of empathy with what they had to face when they came back here, and the confusion, the disloyalty that they received from both government and their supposed supporters in many cases. But on the other hand, my overall sympathies, of course, lay with the National Liberation Front, and I made no bones about that. I felt very ambivalent towards them. On the one hand, I felt a certain amount of empathy. I knew how rotten it must be to be there. On the other hand, my sympathies really lay with the National Liberation Front, and therefore, of course, I supported them politically.